Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. Now, did you know that about 1 out of every 33 people in Taiwan is a Southeast Asian migrant worker? But why do they choose Taiwan, and are they making the right choice? Well, over the next 2 episodes of Connected, we'll look at the hopes migrants bring with them as they seek work in other countries and how they often misalign with reality. And for our discussion, we welcome Dr. Isabelle Cockel, a senior lecturer at the University of Portsmouth in the UK, but currently here in Taipei. And we have Lennon Wong, the director of SPA Service Center and Shelter for Migrant Workers. Thank you both for being on the show and welcome. I will start with you, Isabelle. Could you first tell us how your research is related to the topic of migrant workers and what kind of work you do with them?
Yes, my research firstly started by looking at marriage migrants, but later on moved on to labor migrants. I looked at sovereignty, how Taiwan claims itself being a sovereign state by implementing immigration legislation, and also citizenship, activism, and most recently I also looked at migrant women's maternity and also how they use a smartphone during the COVID-19 pandemic to continue their work. So that is what I do in a nutshell.
All right, and to you, Lennon, can you tell us a little bit more about your work with the SPA Service Center and Shelter for Migrant Workers?
Yeah, we established the shelter about 9 years ago. So over the past 9 years, we sheltered more than 1,700 migrant workers. So basically our work is focusing on the migrant workers, the blue-collar migrant workers from the 4 nationalities: Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, and Thailand. And now we have 3 shelters. We accept the cases, the complaints from the migrant workers. We help them to file the cases to the Ministry of Labor and follow up their cases and attend the mediation meetings in the labor offices throughout Taiwan and shelter them. And many of them, they have not only the labor cases, they might have civil cases or criminal cases. So we follow up their cases, go through the judicial system, and finally they need to transfer. So we help them to transfer to a new job through the public channel. And we also do a campaign and advocacy works with the labor groups in Taiwan and international. So this is a nutshell what we have been doing over the past years.
Right, and that is one of the things I want to discuss a little bit later about accountability and seeking justice and recourse. But I want to start with the bigger picture here. Isabelle, Lennon named some of the countries that the migrant workers here come from. Can you give us a picture of, in Asia, where do most of the migrant workers come from, especially the ones that work in this region, in East Asia and North Asia?
So if I can start first, then in terms of Taiwan, they come from 4 major countries, actually 5, but if you look at the government statistics from Mongolia, there's only 1 person. So let's leave Mongolia aside. So to Taiwan, mainly from Vietnam, the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. And these 4 so-called sending countries also send the workers to the region. That includes the high-income economies in Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore. These are the major, also they happen to be the developmental state which reached really high level of development in the past 70 years. But in addition to these, more recently, we have also seen the Thailand, Malaysia, Brunei also became the receiving states for workers from South Asia. That includes Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. In terms of South Korea, they also have workers from Central Asian states. That includes Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and in Japan. Interestingly, in Japan, you also have workers from Brazil and Peru. They are known as the Nikkei, the ethnic Japanese immigrants who left Japan 100 years ago, but now their offspring came to Japan. So that is overall what we call migration corridors in this part of the world.
Right, and if we drill down into the jobs and industries, Lennon, here in Taiwan especially, they're not evenly distributed across industries and sectors. What kind of jobs do most migrant workers do here?
Yeah, there are several major sectors for the migrant workers in Taiwan, blue collar, I mean. So the biggest chunk are the industrial or manufacturing sector. They work in different various sectors of factories in Taiwan, from traditional factories to high-tech electronics, including the semiconductors companies in Taiwan. And they are about 500,000. Okay, there are over 730,000 migrant workers in Taiwan, and almost over 500,000 are in the industrial sector, and that includes some in the manufacturing, some in the construction sectors, and also some in the agricultural. And there's another bigger chunk, about over 200,000. They are in the social welfare sector, and most of them are household caretakers, where there is a specific patient or ward that the workers need to take care of. They might be elderly, or they might be sick or almost bedridden, so the workers need to take care of them. This part is quite different from like the countries and areas like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia, where the domestic workers are usually domestic helpers. In Taiwan, they are mostly domestic caretakers, and there's only about less than 2,000 of them are domestic helpers. And another smaller sector among the social welfare still, there are 10,000 to 2,000. They are the caretakers in the facilities, like nursing home. There is a very small sector, but very vulnerable, the fishing sector. And among the fishing, they are once again divided into two. The coastal or domestic fishing, where are still, they just go to the sea for one day or a few days. They won't go too far. They are still under the Taiwan labor laws. And there's another sector, about 20,000 of them. They are the distant water fishermen. They will go very far, and they might stay several months or even even a year at sea. And they're under the fishing laws. They are excluded from the labor laws, just like the domestic workers.
Right, and that's very, very specific to Taiwan, especially when you're talking about the fishing workers. I want to, but other parts of what you said seem to be a pattern we see across other countries who are taking a large number of migrant workers. So Isabelle, can you tell us what patterns resonate with other countries here that have migrant workers, especially from Southeast Asia, and the kind of industries and the jobs they do?
Yeah, so actually Lennon has given us a very clear picture from Taiwan's point of view, but that itself is also, in a sense, similar to the receiving state in those places where I just mentioned. So overall, in economies such as Macau, Hong Kong, to some certain extent, Singapore, they are mostly attracting domestic workers. But Lennon made a very good distinction. In Taiwan, they are mostly hired as care workers, but they do a lot of domestic work, because domestic workers in Taiwan are domestic workers belong to a very specific category. Only very few people could be qualified for that, because the way this develops in this particular pattern is because the government considers domestic work as some kind of luxurious support for household work. But care work is to help the people who cannot manage the care labor for the elderly, the sick, and the very young. So if you hire most women you've seen on our street, particularly when they were waiting for giving away the rubbish, or you see women working behind a store in an open market or in a field, They are mostly being hired as care workers. Nevertheless, they're seen as a very available labor at home, so you can ask them to do any kind of work because they're subject to that kind of power relation to their employers. So that is a specific sector that is mostly dominated by women. So in addition to domestic work or care work that is mostly homebound, and you also have, as Lennon said, industrial workers working at a factory, or construction workers working at major infrastructure projects, which were actually the very first batch of workers being employed by the government in Taiwan. But in addition to this, interestingly, in Macau, you can have a live-out maids, so they don't stay in an employer's home. In Malaysia, you have the plantation workers mostly from Indonesia and also from the Philippines. In addition to all of these, you also have the fishermen who seem to be a lot more mobile in terms of the distance they travel as a worker, but they're also less mobile because they're confined to the fishing boat, particularly those at the high sea. So this is a general picture. And Taiwan, and we haven't mentioned the agricultural workers. So Taiwan recently, in April 2019, started a very small number as a trial to recruit agricultural workers. And agricultural workers are also being hired in Japan, South Korea. But of course, not in Hong Kong because the specificity of the economy. So this is the general picture. In a sense, it's very similar. It's similar in this. Well, how should I put it? It's similar because in these countries, the way the economy has developed has made people develop specific attitudes towards work. The dangerous, the dirty, the difficult or demeaning kind of work has been shunned by local workers.
Isabelle, I'm so glad you brought up the whole idea of attitudes, the perceptions, in fact. And this is where I bring you in, Lennon. You know, these migrant workers are brought in to do some of the toughest jobs in probably the most insufferable conditions. Yet there's perceptions and stereotypes about them, and often very negative. Can you tell us about some of the negative stereotypes in Taiwan in particular that is hurting them and hurting their ability to get their rights recognized?
Yeah, I would say the racism and the discrimination against the Southeastern migrant workers is very common, and it's deep inside the system and the culture. But sadly, it's not well perceived and not well self-criticized by the Taiwanese society. Even though there are legal protections over the migrant workers, but there are so many restrictions that's only for the migrants. For example, the migrants, they are not entitled to transfer freely. They cannot really transfer as they want. If it needs to be agreed by their employer, or they have to complain with very valid reason or accusation against their employers or brokers, and that takes a lot of efforts. And also that they have to stay with the employer, or they have to stay in the place assigned by the employer. For the domestic workers, they have to stay in the place with the employer. So most of the time, they have to, for example, especially for the caretakers, they have to stay with the patient, and most of the time they don't even have their own room. And so these are just some of the common situations that they are facing. There's some kind of legal protection on them, but actually they're still very strictly. They are totally excluded from many laws.
Yeah, I thought, yes, Lennon gave us another really clear context. So I thought I'd extract from there. What he's pointing at is the lack of mobility, the lack of freedom, and the sense of a temporariness. The lack of mobility means that although very ironically, you are migrant workers, you move across border to come to one country away from your home country, but after you arrive here, you are everyday life, and also your occupational freedom is being controlled by the government. As Lennon mentioned just now, there's a very strong conceptualization of migrant workers being a source of danger, a source of threat. So how did you contain the threat? Is to ask them to stay at a registered address. And this registered address is usually either the employee's home or the workplace or the dormitory. So that the law makes it very clear, if you're away from this address for missing for 3 days, you'll be considered as a missing person. So that is very clearly to see that migrant workers' mobility, the freedom of moving around is going to cause a law and order problem. That's the first thing. The second thing, Lennon mentioned just now about the restriction on the time they can serve in Taiwan. On the one hand, is to do with the labor pension. So the law is written in a specific way that allows them to stay in Taiwan in a maximum length, but short of the time that they can be entitled to labor pension. Another way of using this technicality is to say that the time they stay in Taiwan cannot be counted towards the duration required for foreign people to apply for residency. That is why scholars argue that they are permanently temporary. So these are the common features in East Asia.
And I do have some numbers to help back up what you're saying about these perceptions, particularly when you talked about the perception of a law and order problem when it comes to migrant workers and why they're put in these situations and these conditions. So one argument often heard against giving migrant workers their freedoms in their country of employment is that they fuel the crime rate. But statistics will tell you that this is very much a misconception. Now, despite fluctuations over the years, migrant workers have consistently committed far fewer crimes than Taiwanese citizens. And you have to remember that Taiwan generally has some of the lowest crime rates in the world, so these numbers are almost statistically insignificant. So you could say that migrant workers are model citizens, except they're not citizens. And so that brings me to a question to you, Lennon. Why is there so much pushback against giving migrant workers citizenships or right to residency?
There is a common fear, as Isabelle mentioned, about the undocumented migrant workers, about the crime rate. But Divya, you also very correctly mentioned the crime rate of the migrant workers is very low. And actually that of the undocumented migrant workers is even lower. Why? Because the most reason for them to be undocumented is because many of them, they don't have a good grievances system. They might try to complain to their brokers, they might try to complain to the government, but they are not satisfied, or it's not fast enough. And maybe, so that's one of the reasons. And some of them, they have been abused, so they try to run away just to find another job. So once they run away, most of them, they just find another job and stay there to work silently. There was Vietnamese undocumented migrant workers who has been shot dead by the police for 9 shots a few years ago, and it has been documented in a movie just recently. And there was another boy, a young boy, whose mother is a Vietnamese spouse. So he's the second generation of new immigrants. He was chased and beaten up by 3 policemen in plain clothes. And the policeman suspected that he is an undocumented migrant worker. So when they found him, they just grabbed him and beat him and tried to arrest him. This boy was heavily injured by them. There were several very sharp and deep injuries on his face. It's a very ridiculous situation. It just reflects how the police see the migrant workers. Actually, in our experiences, many police, when you report something to ask them to rescue the migrant workers, the first question they might ask was, well, is he or she an undocumented? Or why he's outside? Where's his employer? Where's his broker? So back to your you laid this question, again, there's a fear, and the government, they want to encourage the foreign citizens, only those skilled or richer professionals. They don't really welcome the blue collar, the so-called low-skilled workers.
Indeed, and it's good that you say that, because actually, especially in Taiwan, while there is more of a structure and infrastructure for the more skilled workers or those brought in as so-called expats, at the same time, migrant workers, whatever the level, still face so many hurdles. And we're running out of time in the show. Before we go, I want to show you this report of someone who has come in at a very different level to the migrant workers that you probably often work with. So this whole time we've been discussing workers, but what happens when you lose the ability to work? Now, legally, all employees in Taiwan have to be insured, but they are still not entitled to the same kind of protections as citizens. And sometimes, despite living and working in the country for decades. TaiwanPlus reporter Louise Watt brings us this report on one man's quiet suffering in a country he chose to make his home.
Good job. You're doing really well today.
Taipei resident Katie Ho cares for her British husband, Michael Boyden, at home in the Taiwanese capital. He was diagnosed with atypical Parkinsonism 4 years ago. Despite living and working in Taiwan since the 1990s, Boyden, as a foreign resident, is shut out of disability benefits, including home visits by medical professionals, something that pains his Taiwanese wife.
I know there are a lot of hate or hater on the internet. They also say things like, go back to your home country. My husband arrived here in 1989. He lived here for 34 years. He left his homeland, UK, in his early 20s, where he lived longest, here.
Before he became ill, Boyden was a business consultant and one-time actor in a Taiwanese film.
Welcome to the 84th graduation ceremony for Tanjiang Arts School. Throughout this year, watching outstanding graduates complete.
Now he counts among up to 170,000 foreigners with disabilities in Taiwan. But only foreigners from Japan can claim disability benefits because of a long-standing reciprocal agreement between Taiwan and Japan. With symptoms similar to Parkinson's disease, in the past 18 months, Boyden lost all ability to communicate and now has to be fed through a tube in his stomach every 2 hours. His wife has to keep working to pay for his care. Without a disability certificate from the government, foreign residents can't apply for subsidised medical services or equipment like wheelchairs, and they can't even park in a disabled parking space. A campaign is on to change that. A petition demanding equal rights garnered more than 1,000 signatures, spearheaded by a non-profit group, Crossroads, which pushes for a more internationally friendly Taiwan.
As far as Taiwan's currently ramping up its efforts to attract talent due to brain drain and an aging population, Taiwan also needs to kind of look at this issue and this glaring issue, and I think about in terms of not just attracting talent to Taiwan, but how do you retain talent?
The Ministry of Health and Welfare says, considering Taiwan's limited resources, it formulates policies and regulations based on the principle that Taiwan's social welfare system should protect the basic rights of citizens. But it also says it has asked the Foreign Ministry to investigate whether Taiwanese in certain countries receive disability benefits, meaning expats from the UK could expect the same protections as Taiwanese living in the UK.
I put some new posts today, Michael.
But for Katie Ho and her husband Michael, any changes that may result from this campaign might come too late.
He really loved Taiwan. Like the people here love the good, bad, and ugly. He loved it. And recently, I think more. I just feel like I'm so sorry. Taiwan doesn't love you back. That's how strongly I feel.
Ho has learned to look after Boyden without help from the state. In the afternoons, she sits with him, reading updates on social media, and they look at photos of their children and grandchildren. She is making the most of the time they have, and she hopes that her country soon gives its foreign residents equal disability rights, so others will be spared some of what she and her husband are going through.
What's that for? What's that for?
Lennon Wong and Louise Watt for TaiwanPlus.
And with that, we've arrived at the end of this show today. A huge thank you to our guests, Dr. Isabelle Cockel, Senior Lecturer at University of Portsmouth, UK, who's currently here in Taipei, and Lennon Wong, the Director of SBA Service Centre and Shelter for Migrant Workers. We'll, of course, be continuing this conversation with you, this very important conversation, in our next episode. But to our viewers, thank you for your company. Do stay connected and do join us for part 2.